Have you ever just stopped to think about the incredible communication network buzzing away inside you right now? I mean, how do billions of cells actually coordinate everything from, growing hair to managing stress? It's like this vast, complex orchestra, but instead of instruments, it's all chemical messages, constantly shaping who we are. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into some really fascinating source material, a great lecture from Stanford University, actually, our mission, to unpack the crucial role of hormones, the endocrine system, in basically running our internal world. We want to give you that shortcut to understanding these unseen forces that shape our biology, our behavior, everything. So here's the plan. First, we'll look at the basics, how cells talk to each other, focusing on the endocrine way. Then we'll dig into the two main types of hormones, their structure, how that dictates what they do. It's key. After that, we explore the brain as the master conductor, how it controls hormone release. And finally, we flip it. How do those hormones circle back and influence the brain itself? Our thoughts, feelings, all of it. Ready to jump in?
It's quite amazing when you think about that jump from single cells, right? They were totally self-sufficient. But then, multicellular life needed coordination. A huge challenge. How do you get billions of cells working together? And that need drove the evolution of some really clever communication methods.
Yeah, it's not just one simple way, is it? Like how we talk. Sometimes it's direct. The most basic is cell contact. Literally cells touching, like passing a note in class. Very direct, very short range. Not broadcast at all.
Then there's paracrine signaling. Still short range, but maybe more like whispering to the people right next to you. A few cells get the message. Happens pretty quickly in that local area, but still not a body-wide thing.
Okay, next up, neuronal communication. This is the fast one, the nervous system stuff. Think of it like texting. Super quick, very specific target. Neurons use electrical signals, action potentials, sometimes over long distances. And then neurotransmitters jump the gap, the synapse. Very targeted.
And that brings us to the main event for today. Endocrine communication. The body's long-distance system. It uses hormones, these chemical messengers, traveling in the bloodstream, like sending an email blast to everyone. It takes longer, sure, but it coordinates everything everywhere. Yeah. Essential for development, stress response, getting the whole body on the same page.
So the big difference, neuronal is like that instant text, super specific. Endocrine is the slower, all-hands email for wide coordination. But here's what really gets me, and you mentioned this source highlights it. Some chemicals can be both. Like dopamine or epinephrine, neuron releases it into blood, bam, it's a hormone.
Exactly. It blurs the lines, doesn't it?
It really does. Shows how efficient the body is, maybe reusing pathways.
Precisely. It's about optimizing communication. So let's dive into these hormones themselves. There's a really fundamental split based on their structure, and that structure changes everything about how they work.
Okay, so that's the peptide hormones versus steroid hormones divide. Tell us about the structure. What are they made of?
Right. Peptide hormones are built from amino acids. They're essentially proteins or bits of proteins.
Yeah.
And because of that, they are hydrophilic. They love water. Think water-soluble. Examples are things like insulin, vasopressin, oxytocin, ACTH.
Okay, water-loving peptides. And steroids.
Steroids come from cholesterol. So they are hydrophobic, they hate water. Or you could say lipophilic, they love fats, lipids. Think cortisol, that stress hormone, or androgens, estrogen. This water-loving versus fat-loving thing, it dictates almost everything else.
It's wild how tiny chemical tweaks, like the lecture pointed out, lead to such different roles. Amazing precision.
Absolutely. And it dictates how they even travel in the blood. Peptides, being hydrophilic, dissolve easily. They just float freely in the bloodstream like little messengers swimming along.
Easy enough.
But steroids, hydrophobic. They can't dissolve in blood, which is mostly water. They need help. They have to bind to carrier proteins, like having a chaperone to get them through the watery environment.
Okay, so different travel plans. Now, they arrive at a target cell. How do they deliver the message? They need receptors, right? But where?
Yes, specific receptors are key. For peptides, since they're hydrophilic, they can't get through the cell's fatty membrane, so their receptors have to be on the cell surface. Binding there is like ringing the doorbell. It triggers a chain reaction inside the cell, a secondary messenger cascade.
So the message gets relayed internally.
Exactly. And this mainly affects proteins already existing in the cell, maybe opening an ion channel. It leads to a quick response, but one that's often relatively short-lived.
Okay, quick off for peptides. What about steroids? They're fat-loving.
Lipophilic. So they can just slip right through the cell membrane. Easy. The receptors usually inside the cell, often in the cytoplasm, sometimes even on the nucleus or the DNA itself.
Inside job.
Right. And when a steroid binds, it usually heads straight for the nucleus to change gene transcription. It's like giving the cell new instructions to build different proteins. This takes time reading the blueprint, building new stuff.
So slower to start, but maybe lasts longer.
Exactly. Slower onset, longer duration of effect. It's a fundamental difference. Quick alert versus long-term remodeling. It's why adrenaline hits fast, but growth hormones work over years.
That makes a huge difference. Okay, let's shift gears. We know what these hormones are, broadly. Now, who's pulling the strings? The brain, right? How does it control their release?
Indeed. Hormones come from glands all over pancreas, testes, ovaries, adrenals, but the brain itself has key endocrine glands, the hypothalamus and the pituitary. These are the big bosses, the master glands.
Yeah, the source called the brain the master of these witless organs, controlling things like testosterone release. Seems a bit harsh on the organs, maybe? Is it pure top-down?
Well, it's definitely the primary command center, but as we'll see, it's more of a conversation with feedback. But let's focus on that command first. The connection between the hypothalamus and pituitary is fascinating because it's actually two different systems side by side, anterior versus posterior pituitary.
Okay, two systems. How does the anterior one work?
The anterior pituitary gets its instructions via blood. The hypothalamus releases specific hormones into a tiny, dedicated blood vessel network, a portal system that goes straight to the anterior pituitary. These hypothalamic hormones then tell the anterior pituitary cells, okay, release your hormone now, like ACTH, into the main bloodstream to travel body-wide.
Got it. Portal vessel, hormone relay. What about the posterior?
The posterior pituitary is different. It's essentially an extension of the brain. Neurons, whose cell bodies are in the hypothalamus, extend their axons all the way down into the posterior pituitary. Hormones like vasopressin and oxytocin are made up in the hypothalamus, travel down these axons, and are stored at the tips in the posterior pituitary, waiting for a neural signal to release them directly into the blood. Much more direct.
Wow. Okay. Direct neural line versus a hormonal relay. And a great example tying this together is the HPA axis, right? Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. Big one for stress. Walk us through that cascade.
Sure. It starts with the brain perceiving stress, signals the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus releases CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone.
Okay, CRH.
CRH travels that little portal vessel to the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary then releases ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, into the general circulation.
ACTH now travels where?
It travels down to the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys, specifically the adrenal cortex. And that tells the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids. The main one in humans is cortisol, the classic stress hormone.
That's a neat chain of command. But what's really elegant is the shutdown mechanism, the negative feedback.
Yes. Once cortisol is circulating, it doesn't just act on muscles or the liver. It travels back up to the brain. It binds to receptors in the pituitary and, importantly, the hypothalamus.
And tells them to chill out.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
It inhibits further release of CRH and ACTH. It's a self-regulating loop designed to bring the system back into balance.
Which is crucial. And understanding that loop helps explain maybe why chronic stress is so bad. It might mess up that feedback, right? Makes it hard to turn off the stress.
Precisely. It can change the sensitivity of those receptors. It's a physical recalibration.
Okay, so the brain sends commands out. Now, let's do the return journey. How do hormones released way out in the body, like cortisol from the adrenals, get back into the brain to influence it? It's like that Paul Revere ride you mentioned, through the bloodstream back to headquarters.
It's a critical part of the loop. But the brain has security. The blood-brain barrier, the BBB, is made of really tight connections between the cells lining the brain's blood vessels.
Yeah.
Very selective about what gets in or out.
So how do hormones navigate that? Steroids first, they're lipophilic.
Right. Fat-loving. Generally, they can slip through the fatty membranes of the BBB relatively easily.
Okay. But peptides, water-loving, they can't just walk through.
Usually not on their own. But the body has ways. There are specific carrier transport systems, like special ferries, that can actively shuttle certain peptide hormones across the BBB when needed.
Ah, so VIP access for some peptides. And this whole BBB thing explains why, say, alcohol hits the brain so easily, but some medicines struggle to get in.
Exactly. What crosses the BBB profoundly affects behavior and treatment options.
So a hormone makes it past the BBB. Now it's in the brain fluid. It still needs a receptor on a neuron, right? And you said location, type, quantity all matter.
Absolutely critical. First, location. Receptors aren't just everywhere. Glucocorticoid receptors, for example, are densely packed in the hypothalamus key for that feedback loop, and also the hippocampus, which is vital for memory and emotion.
Suggesting those areas are really tuned into stress signals.
Precisely. Then, type. One hormone, like dopamine, might have several different receptor subtypes, D1, D2, etc. Binding to one type can cause a different effect than binding to another. This adds layers of complexity and explains some individual differences. Think variations in vasopressin receptors affecting social bonding.
Wow. And quantity.
The sheer number of receptors matters. More receptors generally mean more sensitivity to that hormone. And here's the dynamic part. Hormone levels themselves can change receptor numbers. Chronic high levels might lead to downregulation, fewer receptors. Chronic low levels might cause upregulation, more receptors. The brain is constantly adjusting its own sensitivity.
Okay, so it's incredibly dynamic. Hormone gets in, finds the right receptor type in the right place, and the number of receptors matters. So what happens then at the neuron level? What can that hormone binding actually do?
It can do a lot. It might change the membrane potential, often via those secondary messengers, opening or closing ion channels, making the neuron slightly more or less likely to fire an action potential, kind of fine-tuning its excitability.
Nudging it one way or the other.
Exactly. Steroid hormones, remember, often go deeper. They can directly change gene transcription, march into the nucleus, alter DNA expression. This is how the brain can actually change its own structure or receptor levels long-term.
Building new stuff or taking old stuff away.
Right. And hormones can also change protein activity and transport, affecting enzymes, structural proteins, things involved in releasing neurotransmitters, forming new connections, really fundamental neuronal processes.
So by tweaking excitability, gene expression, protein function, hormones are basically shaping how brain circuits operate.
Fundamentally, yes. They subtly but powerfully sculpt neural activity. And therefore, our overall behaviors, our responses, how we experience the world.
Which connects directly to all those areas we want to explore later. Stress, sex, aggression, mood. It underlines that everything we've just discussed, hormone levels, receptor differences, that dynamic interplay influences how those behaviors actually play out in each of us. It's not just psychological, it's deeply biological. Okay, let's try and wrap up the core ideas from this deep dive. What are the absolute key takeaways?
I think first, that fundamental split between peptide and steroid hormones, based on being water-loving or fat-loving. That dictates their travel, where the receptors are, and ultimately whether they trigger fast, short-term effects or slower, longer-lasting changes by altering gene expression. It's a core principle.
Right. Second, the brain, specifically the hypothalamus and pituitary, acts as the master controller, orchestrating hormone release body-wide. The HPA axis is that perfect example, showing the command cascade and that crucial negative feedback loop for balance. Understanding that loop is key to understanding things like chronic stress.
And third, it's a two-way street. Hormones released elsewhere travel back, cross the blood-brain barrier if they can or have help, bind to specific receptors in the brain where location, type, and number all matter hugely. And by binding, they influence neurons profoundly, changing electrical activity, gene expression, protein function, ultimately shaping behavior.
So it's this constant dynamic conversation, hormones influencing the brain controlling hormones, all adapting to our internal state and our external world. So maybe the final thought for you listening is, what does this incredible, invisible symphony of chemical messages tell you about your own body's adaptability? How it's constantly subtly reshaping itself based on everything you experience? We hope this dive gives you a new appreciation for that hidden orchestra inside you. It's truly remarkable.